I know there's more people coming in, and I'm going to give it a couple of more minutes. But anyway, what I will do now for you guys, you haven't been in class. I didn't add you to my mailing list, but I'll add you to my mailing list.
Oh, okay.
And, on the day before the class, I send out day before the class, I send out the material, the workbook material, which you can have a copy of, PDF, which you can have a copy of. But it's nothing that you need to go over everything. But
G.
right.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just. Yeah, it's in him, it's very.
Right. Wrong copy.
Say no. He is in brother. So you heard him say he is in brother. When we actually moved here about a year. I just been around for years, but very fun. Here in Dayton.
All right. So you're not getting. Let's just try.
Oh,
In fact, I want to see if Randy's right before us. Randy.
Your work.
Yeah.
Oh. It's sheer miracle that it works anymore.
Right. All right. I'm just gonna talk, okay, and you're just gonna have to listen, and you can just, and I will, now that I know how to do this, I will have visual aids for you next week. So in the meantime, I'll try and talk so descriptively that you don't need visual aids, okay? You won't need it. So when I've taught this class before, and a few of you have been here, but since we have a few repeaters, I have to, the way I'm supposed to teach it is to say, what does a Jew look like? And, what does a Jew look like? And then when I'm taught in the early days, people would draw, somebody with a hat on, or some other drawing. The point was to say that Jews come in all flavors. They don't look like one thing or anything particular, that you cannot draw a picture of a typical Jew, that we are a more diverse people than people understand or realize. And I think most people know that nowadays, but 25 years ago or 35 years ago or 50 years ago, when I was Still teaching class. Just haven't learned anything yet. But anyway, I mean, I think people were surprised to find out that there was as much diversity in the Jewish community that they really had never seen as much diversity. But especially as the state of Israel and people have traveled more and traveled to Israel and seen, seen more diverse communities, they recognize that the stereotypical American Jewish, Eastern European Jew was not necessarily was typical of all of world Jewry. The Jews come in all, from all kinds of cultures. And however, that leads me to say the Eastern European Jews who come from the Eastern European area are often referred to as Ashkenazi Jews because the Eastern Europe was known in the Jewish world as Ashkenaz. That was the name of it, Ashkenaz. And
does it mean anything?
it probably means Eastern European Jews. It probably does have a meaning, but I don't know what the meaning is. But it probably means like Eastern European or Jews from the East or something like that. But that was a broad area. It was a broad area that contained a lot of different countries and a lot of different a number of different ethnic groups in that broad area, going all the way from Russia to Germany and some beyond Germany. And it especially became important as Jews were forced through migration and being banished from lands into an area called the Pale of Settlement. That Pale of Settlement, which nowadays is the area of Lithuania and Belarus, Poland, what I would call Eastern European area, that Pale of Settlement became a very big center of world Jewry, and would also become, for various reasons, the major source of Jews who moved to America, who moved to the United States, mostly to avoid persecution. And that happened in American history. That happened in like from the late 1800s to around 1924, 26, 28, when that immigration happened. But there were Jews in America before then. Those Jews mostly came from Germany. They were among the first settlers in the United States. And they brought a unique kind of culture, German Jewish culture, to America. That is where the Reform movement began. So we'll talk about that in a minute. It's really the point of this class is to talk about some of the diversity in the Jewish community today. But anyway, these German Jews brought with them some of their practices and communities from Germany. Later on, the Ashkenazi Jews would come. There were other Jews living in North Africa, the Arab countries, Israel, what is now known as Israel. They and Spain, they are called the Sephardic Jews. And one could easily imagine that in the 1700s, 16, 17, 1800s, these Jewish communities, while to us they seem maybe you know, geographically close to one another. I mean, to us, Spain and Germany and Russia, that's all on some other continent over there. You know, they're all close to one another. They were very far apart. They didn't have internet. There was no Netflix or streaming. No, I mean, besides that, these communities were fairly isolated and developed their own practices, their own languages that were mixtures of Hebrew and the local language. And for example, in the Ashkenazi areas, Yiddish became the lingua franca, the popular language among the Jews in that area. Yiddish itself is Monica knows more about it maybe than me, but Yiddish itself is a mixture of German and Hebrew. It's written in Hebrew letters. I believe there are some other languages in Yiddish that are mixed in there. Russian, yeah, Russian. That was the language that those Jews had among themselves. But in the Sephardic areas, Ladino became the popular language, which is a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and some of the Hebrew words as well. And that became, their language. But even more interesting than the fact that they had their own languages, they also, because they were far apart from each other, they also developed different ways of practicing and understanding Judaism. And it's not so surprising because we are really still living in a time when we're getting used to this idea of the fact that regional differences are disappearing throughout the world. And to give you an example, I recently had a conversation with someone about my Southern accent. I don't think it's very strong, but they noticed that, I was born in the South, and in English I have a Southern accent, depending on who I'm talking to and where I am, of course. But strong Southern accents are becoming less common as people are now, exposed to television and radio. But there were, growing up, to this day, it's to some degree, I can identify a New Orleans accent or Wisconsin accent. But it's becoming less, that's going away a lot. But these communities develop different religious practices, so that when they immigrated to America or to other places, they stayed in their groups practicing the kind of Judaism that they brought with them from their home country. So if you're in a synagogue here in America to this day that was founded from a largely Sephardic population, you will find in their prayer book, yes, they have many of the same prayers that the Ashkenazi Jews will have, but they will have very different prayers as well. And they might have different prayer practices as well. And they have slightly different understandings of how Jewish customs and rituals, such as even kashrut, are handled. And you say, this is a mess. How come they all didn't do the same thing? I don't think it's a mess. I think it's a wonderful example of diversity. It's a wonderful way for us to understand that communities develop, that they are not, that they go through an evolution among themselves especially over generation. These Ashkenazi, Sephardi, there's another group, the Mizrahi, the Eastern Jews, who came from at places like India and other countries like that, Iraq, and they had Turkey was more Mizrahi. They have their own languages and their own ways of doing it. To this day, you want to go and see a Jewish community, if you're ever in Los Angeles, the Jewish neighborhood of Pico Robertson, which for a long time was a very Ashkenazi neighborhood with signs in Yiddish. When I was a little boy, I went to signs in Yiddish. Today, it's still a very Jewish neighborhood, but all the signs are in Farsi because the residents, who are heavily Jewish, are all Persian Jews, and the synagogues there reflect the Mizrahi or Persian influences in the tunes they use and in the practices they have. And the food is amazing. And the food is amazing. And but so here,
my family comes long ago. I was Iran.
From Iran, yeah.
When we go to Israel, but when they go to Israel, they'll stop me at the border and do extra questioning because there's some terrorists with us. So, so if they stop during, boy, they freak out.
Sure. Absolutely. But by the way, the Farsi that they speak in the Persian or Iraqi is known as Judeo-Farsi. It's also a mixture of languages. There were Jews in small Jewish communities in Africa as well. And people are surprised sometimes to find that out, that when the diaspora came about and Jews fled from Israel, they spread out everywhere, Egypt, Arab lands, but also Africa. And one of the richest sources of Jewish archaeology is in Ethiopia. Today, one of the fastest growing Jewish communities is in Uganda, where some of the tribes, Uganda and Guyana, some of the tribes, because they became connected to the internet, recognize that their traditional practices, they all had been converted to Christianity by missionaries. But when they went back and look at their traditional tribal practices, they recognized that they were closer to Judaism than they were Christianity, and have begun to adopt Jewish practices. Very interesting thing about that is that some years ago, when we got our about 10 years ago, we got a new prayer book. I shipped a lot of our old prayer books, the old Sim Shaloms, to Uganda. And I got a picture back not long after that of this guy in a village saying, he said, "Thank you very much." He opened the book up and it said, "Property of Congregation for the Gainesville, Florida." As far as I know, they're still using it. I hope they don't return it. That's because so many Eastern European Jews came to America, Yiddish became a very strong force in previous generations. My grandparents, for example, all four of my grandparents, when immigrated to America in the 1910s, between 1910 and 1920, all spoke Yiddish. That Yiddish was their native language. And I was just showing someone, I have the letter written in Yiddish to my grandmother in 1910 from her father who had already come to America saying, please come to Florida. Florida. But anyway, but Yiddish words have entered in now to the English vocabulary and become very normal. So some of you got in the handout that I sent to some of you, you'll see that there is a little list of some Yiddish words. You don't even need to worry about it because the words you probably know, like kvetch, which means to complain, or nosh, which means a snack, or chutzpah. I did feel a lot that shows up in movies. Chutzpah, which means to have a nerve. Shlap, shlemiel, mishmash. I'm not even sure. Maybe it's Yiddish. I'm not sure. Maybe it is. It could be. Sounds like it should be. But sugarnut certainly Yiddish. Yeah, right. I was thinking of that. So that's an interesting thing. But those come from the Ashkenazi. Also, when you hear about, some people will say, well, I Jewish foods, all Jews love corned beef and pickles and gefilte fish. But that is Ashkenazi Jewish food. Okay, and I remember, it's already been some years ago, but my wife and I went back to where my grandparents lived and were born, and we were in this small village in Belarus, and we sat down at a restaurant for lunch with our tour guide and looked at the menu, and it was like I was in my grandmother's house. I thought that these were all foods that were unique to my grandmother and to Jewish culture. No, it was like borscht and pierogies. And whatever. It was, what was she cooking? She was cooking the Eastern European food, what she grew up eating, kosher version. But so things like gefilte fish are not like, if you are even a bagel, which people think is a basic Jewish food, it's an Ashkenazi food. And if you're in Israel, where there are a lot less Ashkenazi Jews, they have bagels, but they're a little bit different from what you think of as a bagel. They're kind of like round, but maybe they have a hole, maybe they don't have a hole in them. So it's just because that we know that as from the United States. So the point of all what I just said, besides giving you a little history and telling you a little about diversity, was to lead you down the path that to this very day, we are still a very diverse community, for better or worse. That all Jews are not the same. We all don't do the same things. We don't even all believe the same things. And yet, we are all Jews. And we recognize each other. And we validate each other. And we work together on projects, usually, and respect each other. So what do you think I mean by the diversity in the American Jewish community today? Diversity? Yeah, what would you say?
today, it's so incredibly diverse in regards to what we think, coming from a Christian perspective, and I always saw that they kind of stick together because they all think the same thing. They all believe this, but then they if you don't believe it anymore, you go find somebody else to believe it. And yet here, everybody it's so diverse. We're all coming to being in front of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're all worshiping. Even I think I've met many that don't even really.
Even, and I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah.
I'm talking about atheists who are Jews. We have atheists
And will still come to the synagogue.
and still come to the synagogue. And there's a kind of burgeoning group of humanistic Jews in Gainesville now who have eliminated the word God from their prayer book. So we talk about it loosely. The easiest way to talk about it is to talk about denominations, but it's really much more complicated than that, because even within the broad definitions of denominations, there are differences. But let me address what are the major groups, the major denominations in America today, and where do they come from, and who are they, and what are they? And if you want more on this, the main thing about this workbook page that I send out is that it has bibliography at the end of it. And the bibliography not only gives you some web resources, but some books to read on more if you want to learn about these topics. But let me start with talking about what I think are the 5 main denominations in American Jewry today based on synagogues, on synagogue affiliation. And that would be Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, and Chabad, or Hasidic Chabad. Okay. So that's what I would say are the 5 are the 5, and they're not in any particular order. So I don't really want to talk about them in order of any, other than to say that I'll start with Reform, just because
Because it's big.
Well, it's the largest denomination. It's the largest denomination in the United States today. And it is actually probably the oldest organized denomination. Because in fact, Reform began as a conscious effort to create a denomination in the mid-1800s, to create a practice of Judaism around the same time that Jews were able to become citizens of countries, and that Jews were moving out of the shtetls and the isolated existence that they had been forced into, and Jews were beginning to live in among general populations. Yes.
So before that time, there really wasn't that construct.
Before that time, there was not that construct because for a few reasons. Number one, Jews all lived in these small shtetls. Each shtetl had their own community of practice, which may be a little different from another one, but they didn't know what was going on in another town. And number two, because they were small communities and persecuted communities, they didn't have that opportunity for organizing themselves into kind of a league or a corporate structure.
Were Jews citizens? Were they given citizenship?
Not until like the French Revolution.
Jews
But no, they were not citizens when they lived
in Germany.
in Germany or Russia or England. That's why they were sent out of those countries often. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Right? They were sent out of those countries because they were not citizens. This idea of citizenship really, there's a whole history of what does it mean to be a citizen. Citizenship come to be, but all of a sudden, Jews found themselves living in communities and working in communities where they were the minority. Because when you lived in a small shtetl, you're still a minority, but there's nobody else living in that community but Jews. So reform movements set about, just as their name says, to be able to reform Jewish practice to be in a way that would allow them to now be Jewish in the places where they were. And you know, it's a heroic effort to say we want to remain Jewish, even though we're no longer in the shtetl. And so things like mode of dress became important because how, you know, they might have had a way of dressing in the shtetl, a traditional way of dressing, that didn't really matter because this is how Jews, the whole little town was Jews. So, I mean, they had their own way of dressing. But now they're in the city. Now they're in a community that has, where they are such a small minority, but they want to practice their faith and their religion. How will they do it when the Sabbath, when businesses are closed on Sunday, but not closed on Saturday? So making accommodations for very practical reasons, not reasons that they wanted to do less, but they wanted to do more, that they wanted to maintain their Jewishness. They wanted to adapt who they were, reform their Jewishness, so that they could now live in this wider Western world.
Assimilate, but yet stay separate.
I don't think it's assimilate. I think assimilate, the inference in assimilate was, I want to become like you. I don't think that was their impetus. Their impetus was, I want to be who I am and coexist with you. So I don't think their impetus was assimilation. Assimilation means you're trying to change, to assimilate in, to become what the other population is. I don't think this was not the way to do it. They wanted to have synagogues. They wanted to have Jewish prayer. They wanted to be who they were, but adapt.
Tone it down a little bit so it's more acceptable to the environment that they're in.
You know, I'm hesitant to even use the term tone it down, because I don't think that was it. They wanted to be able to adapt to the world that they found themselves in. And they did. And early Reform Judaism really became a refuge for this burgeoning middle-class Jewish population that was living in Europe and would eventually as well immigrate to America. At some point in the late 1800s, 1896 or around 1900, in America, some of the, which largely had this Reformed Jewish community opening up all around. Some of the Jews who were in America especially those who'd come from right out of the shtetls in Eastern Europe, felt that they wanted to conserve more of the tradition, that they wanted more of what they knew in Eastern Europe to be conserved. And so they began the denomination that I grew up in and that I'm a part of, which is called conservative Judaism. Term conservative, which is a terrible term in the year 2025. I mean, if you're conservative, you're conservative Republican or something. Apologies, but the term itself does not mean anything about political ideology for conservative Jews. It only reflects this idea of some Jewish communities to say, let's conserve some of the tradition. Not all of the tradition, we're going to conserve some of the tradition. Both in Reform Judaism and in Conservative Judaism, there has always been this understanding that Jewish life was never static. Since the fall of the temple in ancient Israel, Jews have always adapted both to where they lived and what was around them and who they were with and what they needed to do. And Jewish practice always adjusted. We did not stay the same community after the temple centralized worship was destroyed. We went from offering sacrifices to offering prayers as a way of worship. We adjusted our practices from the community being led by dynastic priests to educated leaders who would be called rabbis. Judaism has always changed and adapted, and this change and adaptation was reflected already in these two denominations that grew out of one another, and that had a kind of, we want to do things in our way and in our thing. I think it was a great thing from my perspective. One of the great strengths of our Jewish communities has been our ability to adapt and to evolve, both in ancient times and in modern times. Without adapting and evolving, we run the risk of becoming irrelevant and stale, in my opinion. So I now gonna talk about what about the other denominations? Yes. Conservative Judaism began in the United States and was American. Now it's worldwide, but it's only known as Conservative Judaism in America. In Europe, in the United Kingdom, Conservative Judaism is known as Reform Judaism. And in Europe and Israel, Conservative Judaism is known as Masorti Judaism, and that means traditional Judaism.
So what is?
In England, Reform Judaism is called Progressive Judaism. Who are the Orthodox Jews? Well, the Orthodox Jews are those who said they came out of Europe and they said, no, we want to practice just as we did in Europe. we're not changing or adapting anything. Problem with that is of course I already mentioned to you how many communities there were in Europe: Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi. So in fact, there did not become one Orthodox community, but a number of Orthodox communities. And to this very day, you will find stark differences among Orthodox synagogues. They might be modern Orthodox. They might be traditional Orthodox. They might be Hasidic, which is a kind of Orthodox, but because of their population, and I'll speak about them a little bit differently. But I'll get to that in a minute. But so there are very strong differences among Orthodox congregations, and for those who are Orthodox Jews, they recognize and understand that an Orthodox synagogue in Maplewood, New Jersey, may be very different from another Orthodox synagogue in Miami Beach, Florida, both of which call themselves Orthodox but have different practices depending on the organizers, where they came from.
So they're different in maybe
They're not different in being authentic to what they believe their ancestors followed in Europe.
Okay.
And typically in Orthodox synagogues, they're going to be very strict as well as traditional in terms of separation of men and women, that men and women will not sit together in general, although there are gradations of that. Some will have a men's side and a women's side. We've even seen some that have a men's side, a women's side, and a mixed side. That's seen, so there been some of that. Some the women can sit on the same level as the men. Others, the women have to sit in the balcony. So there's a lot of variation there. There's variation in conservative and reform too, but not as much because those denominations had a stronger central authority. And then there's Chabad, and I used to just throw Chabad in with the Orthodox, but because Chabad has become so popular and strong, I talk about them separately, because Chabad grew out of what's called Hasidic Judaism, or a kind of ultra-Orthodox Judaism, even more strongly insisting on their traditional mode of dress and practices, to the point that because their leader who came to America in the 1950s wore a particular style hat, they wear that same particular style hat from the 1950s. Okay. Because they say, well, that's their Jewish hat, but Chabad really is the essence of Chabad, besides the fact that they have a very, very centralized organization. One particular person who's the Rabbi, but he died, but there are others who took his place. A very centralized organization that manages all of their synagogues and all of their affiliates, in the way some Christian churches do. Are organized with strong central, and some are not.
Yeah.
and their focus has always been what they call K-Roof or outreach. That is why they began their college age program, because they wanted to reach out to college students, and they see their mission is to reach all Jews. So,
But that's
yes.
not to suggest for them to be Hasidic, right? It's just very or
Yeah, they would say they don't try to get them to become Hasidic, but they try to get them to support who they are, to support their organization, and to be involved in Jewish life in general. So, in practicality, it's probably a little more complicated than this, because everything is more complicated in practicality. But that's the official line. So in terms of, let's say, what are some differences? Go ahead. Yes,
Can I ask?
yes. Well, some Chabad rabbis call him the Messiah. They would argue, they would say that they believe he had a special kind of holiness. That's a point of contention within their group. Clearly, the idea that there's a Messiah who died is a Jesus.
There's a guy in 60.
Shabtai Tzvi, as you were talking about, yeah. There have been a number of people in over Jewish history who either declared themselves as the Messiah or were declared as the Messiah. And in the case of Schneerson, he did not declare himself a Messiah. Some people said he was just such a great leader. They think he should have been the Messiah. But
Rather than so they would declare him a Messiah rather than a prophet.
well, I mean, I think mainstream Chabad would not would want to not call him Messiah. They might feel that he was a messianic figure, but not want to call him that. And I think, but his influence, he was
So
a
then
strong
is it a
leader.
prophet? Then would that be
A prophet is someone who talks with God. He never said he talked to God. Okay, so he never became never was a prophet. He was a strong leader, and in every Chabad synagogue or restaurant or institution to this day, his picture is on the wall. Which is itself is interesting, because for many Orthodox Jews, pictures of living people or people who lived in the past are prohibited. So that's a strong, well, they're making us, by putting his picture up, they're making a strong statement to other Orthodox Jews. Okay, it's not a statement without meaning. They're making a strong statement. This person, you might not allow pictures in your synagogue, but we are going to put up a picture of our leader. He was who he was. That immediately divides them from some Orthodox Jews. Yeah. Usually they are, or the ultra Orthodox are. So there are. I'm not. No, they're not Chabad. They're not Chabad. Chabad is in Israel as well. They have their own communities, but they're usually other Hasidic groups. There are many. There are probably 100 different Hasidic groups, all coming from different villages. Lubavitcher is the name of the village that the Chabad group come from. Chabad is an acronym for their with their synagogues. Lubavitchers is what they call themselves. They all come from this place called Lubavitch. But there are other Hasidim from towns called Lubavitch and all kind of little towns, and they all have their own synagogues.
Isn't the word Mashiach, isn't that like something that, what you think Mashiach means? I mean,
Well, I'll tell you what, you're going to hear a lot of that from powerful speakers.
oh, okay.
We'll get to that topic. For those of you who come to that class on Saturday morning, they'll talk about that. The word itself has had a lot of different meanings over the course of traditions. But anyway, let me talk about differences in practices, and so many of you have been to other denominations.
That's what the reconstruction is.
I forgot, left out the Reconstructionist, which is now very small. But that Reconstructionist Judaism is a breakaway from conservative Judaism, that is a modern breakaway from the 1950s, around 1955, where a conservative rabbi is named by the name of Mordecai Kaplan wanted to reconstruct Judaism for the 1950s with an emphasis on community. Let me talk about the emphasis here in some of these various denominations. Emphasis in Reform Judaism is on individual decision making, and that the individual has the right and responsibility to make their own religious decisions. Emphasis on conservative Judaism is an emphasis on conserving some traditional values and on the community and the leaders of the community making the decisions for the community. Orthodox Judaism, an emphasis is strongly on preserving the tradition according to the strict interpretations that they followed in previous generations with no changes. Reconstructionist Judaism values the community. Each individual synagogue, each community makes their own decisions. Mordecai Kaplan was very much understood that community didn't just mean religious events, but meant communal events like swimming pools and basketball teams. In the 1950s, there was an emphasis on Jews having their own. They couldn't go into other suburban places having their own. And I mentioned Chabad being outreach, centralized and so the differences in practice, however, how do they work out? In practice, what you will find is that synagogues vary a tremendous amount from city to city, from synagogue to synagogue. In terms of practice, typically you'll find, but not always, you'll find more English in a Reform synagogue than a conservative synagogue, but not always. You'll find a good amount of Hebrew in a Reconstructionist synagogue, more Hebrew, because Hebrew, that was important to Mordecai Kaplan, everybody speak Hebrew. In an Orthodox synagogue, you'll find less English, or maybe no English in the service. You also find separation of men and women. In conservative and Reform synagogues, you'll find that men and women sit together and serve as rabbis and synagogue officers. The difference being that in Reform synagogues, we're much faster to adopt egalitarianism Then in conservative Judaism, and egalitarianism in the Reform movement came about in the 1950s. As in 40s, I mean, already men and women were sitting together. In the 50s, women were already beginning to serve as rabbis. Didn't happen in the conservative movement until the 1980s. Men and women sitting together happened in the 50s, but women becoming ordained as rabbis happened in the 80s. Other issues like inclusion of gay and lesbian couples and all kinds of issues regarding practice and dietary things vary across the stream. Understandings in interpretation vary to some degree as to and if you want to read more on this, you can, but there are some theological underpinnings, such as what is the Torah? Where is it? Where did it come from? Is it the verbatim received word of God written down by Moses? Is it a text that was written by human beings and inspired by human beings? Or is it a totally human invention that was adopted by the Jewish community? Each of these denominations has different ways of looking at some of these questions. And while in practicality they may not be big deals, they have some underpinning philosophies that may express themselves in services or practices or the way the communities go about handling the Kabbalah is a philosophy or practice of Judaism that developed alongside Judaism in the 1500s, like 1400s, 1500s, and influenced all Jews, some who became very devoted to the study of Kabbalah, but all the influence of Kabbalah entered into all Jewish communities, some more than others. No, they don't have their own. Now, there are also some smaller denominations. I mentioned a minute ago humanistic Judaism, which is a small denomination, just a few synagogues, half dozen, where God has been, the belief in God is not a part of their liturgy or a part of their practice. However, they study the Torah and they, have events and Shabbat and things like that. They just are atheists in practice. There are other small denominations as well, but what is not a Jewish denomination, and let me be clear about this, is Messianic Judaism. Messianic Judaism is not another denomination of Judaism. Once they affiliate or become a part of the Christian community, accepting the New Testament and Jesus, they are outside of the mainstream of the Jewish denominations. So there are borders to what it means to be a Jew, and although there's diversity, it doesn't mean that anything can go anywhere. Now, in every one of these groups, there are Jews who fall in a whole range of observances. So it's not really correct to say that all Orthodox Jews all people who go to an Orthodox synagogue are Orthodox Jews. Randy grew up in a synagogue in Jacksonville, where I know for a fact, my relatives who went to that synagogue, who was an Orthodox synagogue, they never walked to synagogue. They just parked at the synagogue next door, I guess, or down the street. They kept kosher at home, but they didn't keep kosher outside of their home, and yet they were members of an Orthodox synagogue for many, many, many years. Same is true to this day with Chabad and Orthodox synagogues. And similarly in a conservative synagogue, you'll have people who really feel comfortable and like the tradition and the tradition